Let's say I have an Aphelios 2 or an Ash 1 and deciding whether to move items over. And let's say you have good items, or
Yeah.
let's say you have a Kiana 2 or a Lee 1. And for argument's sake, we could assume we have a backup Aphelios 2 or Kiana 2 on bench. I struggle in these situations to determine, is the fully atomized Ash 1 better or worse than the fully atomized Aphelios 2?
Right. I think in general, the forecasts do tend to be better just right now,
Mm.
pure numbers wise. There are certain scenarios where you're probably better off doing one or the other. So, for example, if you already have Faded in and you can get the AD on Aphelios, you're probably playing Aphelios, right? But if it's just the standard four snipers, I think that it's a little bit better to have it on the Ash. And there are other things, right? Like Kiana items are actually somewhat different from leased in items, right? So if you're still primarily leased in items, so something like Titan Starics BT is like a very standard set of leased in items, right? If those are your items, you're probably going to move those off of Kiana and move them onto the leased. You have something a bit more geared towards like Last Whisper, IEGA or something like that. You could probably keep them on Kiana and up until you get a solid backline carry, that's where you want to move those, right? If I have Blast Whisper IE, I'll probably move those onto a Triss 2 before I move anything onto the Lee Sin, right? So I'd say in general, because I think item-wise, things are not that flexible in a sense, right? So if you've really built the items towards a particular unit, then you want to have them on the unit. I think the snipers is slightly different because Aphelios items and Ash items, this is why it's a little bit different for that compared to Duelist, is that Aphelios items and Ash items are essentially the same thing, right?
Right.
So at that point, it's kind of like, okay, uh, if I have Ash 1 versus Aphelios 2, if I can afford to fit Faded on the board, if that's what I have right now, like let's say I have Syndra 2 plus Aphelios, and I'm playing just like two snipers, four wardens, or something like that, probably going to have those items on the Aphelios just because it's a little bit stronger. And then you can think about moving them later when you hit the action upgrade. But that sort of would be my recommendation. It's just like you just have to kind of look at where your items are at the current moment and be like, is this better or not? Like, if I have Leeson items, but they're on the Kion, I'm probably going to move it, right? It's sort of it's definitely a bit nuanced, I would say, but I think that what it really comes down to is like what was going to be best enabled, in a sense, right? Yeah, I think that the sniper one is pretty. It's just a very straightforward sort of example, right? Because you can really just set them apart based off of trait. And then duelists, when you look at that example, it's sort of mainly based off of item, right? Because duelist board is always going to be just like 6 duelists plus, whatever the standard heavenly / dragon lord unit, and that comes down to like items, right? And there's some other stuff. I think that I'm trying to think about what other types of there are. It really only applies to those two. There are sometimes, I guess, for example, Sage, right? When do I move items off of Zyra to put
Zyra
them on like
2 and
Morgan or right?
yeah. In that situation, I would assume Zyra 2 is better than Morg 1.
Yeah, yeah. Typically, Zyra 2 is better than Morg 1. And it's not like a very clear cut answer, right? That's sort of just based off of what you understand about the units in terms of their relative strength, right? Like sometimes if I have a bar 2, I'm just going to sell that unit and move the items over anyways. Um, Especially if I don't have something like a Rage Blade. I think Bard without Rage Blade is especially just like not there. But if you have something like I was playing a game today where I was playing like 4 Trick Shot and I ended up carrying Bard for the entire game just because I had to like Rage Blade Red Buff in the Hurricane and I had those on the Bard and you know there aren't going to be any other Trick Shot. You can just use those items better than Bard is, right? So I had like Bard 3 at the very end of the game with like those exact items. But you know that versus if I had just like Last Whisper IE, obviously, even if it's a Bard 2, I'm going to get those items off immediately. Right?
Right.
So it's just like, just evaluating one, how strong is that unit? And two, how well does it work with those items and the trait that you currently have, right? It's definitely not an obvious decision. So I think that you really want to kind of just break it into, you know, try to get the main decision points in your head, and then you can sort of make a checklist, right? It's the same thing with, the reroll checklist. If you do something with your item checklist, right? You say like, okay, one, do my items make sense for me to move? And two, or one, do my items make sense to move? Two, what's the better unit? And three, what's enabled by my trinkets, right? If you think about those three, and then you're probably going to be able to come up with just a solid decision. Obviously, you might not always make the right decision because, it's like 40%, 60%, 45, 55, which one's correct and which one isn't. You know, it's never always going to be a correct decision just because you might not always know what's better, what's going to do more damage, value 2 or Ash 1. Because it might not always be the same every game, but that's sort of what I would just recommend is sort of thinking about those three things, just like items, the traits, and how those particular units are.